Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today and for the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to hear what Farah had to say. It sounds it's actually more good news than I expected to hear, and I guess I want to build on that in the few minutes that I have. I'd like to change the focus from the on-the-ground community experience to the bigger picture in terms of where Canada is today, based on research evidence that's ours and others. So we'll see if this works. There's certainly plenty of evidence for xenophobia here in Canada. I don't think we need to talk about the existence of that. Protesting groups, political maneuvering, such as in the last federal election, some individuals amongst us who have acted out sometimes with fatal consequences. And of course, the overshadowing that we're experiencing now with Donald Trump in the US and what he seems to have unleashed in that country and perhaps beyond. But that's anecdote, that's actual specific examples, and I want to look at some research to provide a broader context that might help maybe correct some of our views or misconceptions and provide a basis for further discussion. So I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to present some research and some insights in the time I have. Starting with the demographic landscape, who we are today as a country. I think this audience, better than most, understands that we are a country of immigrants. But I think the latest numbers from Statistics Canada and the census, 2016 census, help really illustrate this well. Because we now know that about 22% of people in this country were born in another country, the highest it's been since 1931, and this is projected to increase fairly significantly over time. And in fact, Stats Canada has concluded that almost 100% of the future population growth in this country will come from immigrants. So that's a fact. We also know that this is a very urbanized country and that our urban centers are places where many immigrants come. These latest numbers, I think, are quite striking, even though we may be expecting this. We now know that almost 8 in 10 residents in Toronto in the CMA are first or second generation. That's 8 in 10. That's quite significant. Other urban areas, not quite as high, but still over 50% or close to it. I think that is something you may understand, but I think many people might be very surprised. But these demographic realities also translate in a political way as well in terms of the political landscape. If we look at Parliament today, there are 46 foreign-born MPs. Foreign-born MPs in all of the parties except the Bloc, and they recently had at least one. And these numbers may not look that remarkable. It's only 46, how come there aren't more? But I think we have to put this in context and understand that this is not happening in any other country in the world to the same extent. It's very unusual in almost any other country for someone who wasn't born there to end up being a member of a national legislature. So I think it puts Canada in a very exceptional position. And I think there are two conclusions we can draw from this. First is that this is a country where somebody can move here from somewhere else, get themselves established well enough to then be elected by people in their community to represent their community in the country. And that's quite an achievement in a lifetime or half a lifetime. The other conclusion, I think, is that this is a country now where winning government requires support from foreign-born citizens and not just from one particular group. And again, this is I think, in many ways exceptional. Excuse me. I want to dwell now on what Canadians think and believe about immigrants and refugees and give you the benefit of some research that you may or may not have seen. It's all public, but may not be that well known. I think we have to start from our history and past. It's undeniable that we have a xenophobic legacy in this country. What I'm showing here are results from a Gallup survey question from 1946, asking about what sorts of groups should be kept out of the country. You can see the results here: Japanese, Jewish, German, and so forth. Significant numbers of Canadians basically told Gallup that these people should not be allowed in the country. So it's not news, but this kind of survey data simply confirms it. And even more recently, to early 1960s, a similar question from Gallup again, asking about whether restrictions on non-whites coming in should be relaxed or not. Most Canadians, small majority, said no, they should not be relaxed. But a lot of things started to change shortly after that. And what I'm showing here is the results of research that Environics has been doing since the 1970s, asking what we will call a key indicator question about the level of immigration in this country. And the question was basically, do you agree or disagree that immigration levels are too high? And what you could see is that there has been a significant shift in public opinion in Canada. In the 70s and 80s and the 90s, most Canadians agreed with that statement, but that has really changed. And in the last decade or so, a majority of Canadians has significantly and reliably or consistently rejected that notion. So that's quite a change. One of the reasons is the perceptions about the economic impact of immigration, and I think what we can see is for much of the last few decades, most Canadians understand or believe that, in fact, immigration is good for the economy, despite whatever concerns in a specific level, and that view is held despite the financial downturns that have been experienced over the past period of time. What about refugees? Obviously current today, but has been current in past decades as well. And we could see a similar change over time where we see that Canadians are much less likely to be concerned about bogus refugee claimants than they were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So this, again, is a fairly significant change over time. And I think what's happened is that the change has been to the point where Canadians overall are starting to see multiculturalism and diversity as a positive identifier and symbol of the country and its identity. So here's a question from a survey we asked last year of Canadians. What makes Canada unique? And this was an open-ended question, so we did not give people these categories to pick from. And at the top of the list, what people are most likely to say that makes this country unique is multiculturalism, diversity, immigrants. Question on another survey, can someone born outside Canada be just as likely to be a good citizen as someone born here? Reliably, 90% of Canadians say yes, that's possible. So this is miles different from the attitudes a few decades ago. And if we put ourselves in an international context, excuse me, from a Gallup survey done a few years ago in terms of tolerance towards others, Canada is up near the top, along with a few other countries in terms of accepting people from elsewhere. But that does not mean unqualified acceptance and everything is just fine. There are concerns about immigrants, and it's primarily in terms of culture and what might be described broadly as values. So here's another statement that we've been asking for a number of years. Do too many immigrants not adopt Canadian values? And what we've seen is that consistently a majority of Canadians have agreed with this statement. It has diminished in the past couple of years, but is still a majority. Of course, people probably are probably thinking about a particular kind of immigrant, but nevertheless. So this suggests that there's a concern that people come to this country and they don't want to be part of this country and they don't want to be Canadian. In fact, we're not seeing that when we actually interview newcomers and immigrants themselves. From one of our surveys, we asked people born in another country whether they identify more closely with Canada or their country of birth, and you can see that most basically identify with Canada, and very few with their country of birth. And I think this slide is more significant. Excuse me. We asked Canadians what values are most important for immigrants to adopt when they come here. And again, an open-ended question. We're not putting these ideas in their heads. And you could see the ones that come to the top, respect for history and culture, fluency in English or French, tolerance for others. The remarkable part about this is that immigrants and native-born are identifying the same values. There's an agreement and alignment on what immigrants should be doing when they arrive. This is not what many Canadians think or fear. We've done surveys with Muslims in Canada, and what we learned from this first is that when we ask Muslims about hostility towards their group, most Muslims feel that it is only parts of Canadian society or small groups of Canadian society that's hostile, not society overall. So they're not seeing most other Canadians as being hostile, and this perception has actually improved over the past 10 years. And when we ask Muslims how they compare the treatment of Muslims in Canada with how they feel Muslims are treated in other Western countries, they're much more likely than not to say that they're treated better here. So in a comparative context, they feel that the Muslim community here is comparatively better. That doesn't mean they don't experience discrimination. We asked about this. 35% of the Muslims we surveyed said that they had experienced discrimination in the past 5 years for a number of reasons, religion, ethnicity, language, or sex. And if you compare it to the population overall, it's clearly higher, particularly with respect to religion. So it's not as if everything is positive and accepting. There are challenges, but we see a mix. So what can we conclude from this research and other research, which I don't have time to show you, about the inclusivity today? There's the positive story. The majority of Canadians are accepting, if not supportive, of immigrants today. And it's an aspiration of not an action. I think a lot of people would really like to be fully supporting if they're not quite there. And that these opinions have held pretty steady over the past couple of years, despite events happening elsewhere in the US and so forth. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the country and the population has come a long way in its acceptance and tolerance, looking back just from a few generations ago. And that immigrants and newcomers themselves are doing their part for the most part in terms of finding a place for themselves in this society and feeling fairly good about being here. Of course, there's also a negative story. So despite these aspirations and some of these viewpoints, many people struggle with the reality of those who look or act different. That is partly human nature, but that's nevertheless part of our experience too. Some differences are more comfortable than others. I mean, some people, some immigrant groups, there are no issues, others there are. Some groups in our native-born society are more comfortable with difference than others. And then there's the minority among us where their perspective goes beyond discomfort to prejudice, anger, and hate. And some of them have been emboldened, and even more so recently, to act on it, sometimes with fatal consequences. And those are those tragic experiences and events that we see, and it's difficult for us to acknowledge that this is part of our country. So the conclusion is not a simple one, and probably isn't satisfying for many people, because it's not sort of a single story, a single narrative, which we all would like to have. Are we good or are we bad? And I think the absence of a single story divides us. There are those of us who think the situation is very positive, exceptionally tolerant, we're a wonderful place, and others that are very angry about what they see as the negative part of the negative experiences, and they see the racism. I think the challenge we all face is to recognize, acknowledge that there are these different parts of our society and our reality, and it's both differences not only in society but within ourselves. Because many of us may feel conflicted ourselves about some of the things that we're talking about. And I think the other thing that we need to struggle with is determine what the standard is for what's acceptable and what's appropriate, and what are we trying to achieve in terms of tolerance and support in this country. Clearly, we're trying to aim towards a point we've never been before. Where is that point? So I want to end with just 3 concluding insights. I hope I'm not too far out of time. 3 things I want to leave you with just to wrap things up. Public opinion is not just one thing. Public opinion is typically very different and divergent across the population. Looking at the overall picture, and some of the slides I've shown you, is really just the starting point. That doesn't give us the whole picture. And it's essential to go deeper to understand more nuance in how the opinions and values are similar or different across the population. And what this means is to collect and disseminate more nuanced studies of public opinion and lived experience. Very pleased to see that Pathways to Prosperity actually has a project like this in the works, so obviously you've anticipated what I was going to suggest. An example of how this might be done comes from a survey we did last year of public opinion about Indigenous peoples, and I don't have time to explain this, but basically what we found was that in the Canadian non-Indigenous population, there are 5 distinct worldviews in terms of attitudes and values about Indigenous peoples. And they all are very distinct. And this sort of information gives us a much more nuanced and constructive view of what the public thinks about that particular group than looking at simple survey results. The second insight is one that I think you all already understand and are probably practicing, that prejudice and rejection is grounded on seeing the other as someone different, for which one has very little in common, and that meaningful personal contact makes it possible to build bridges and recognize the similarities and find common ground. And so where there are opportunities to develop those meaningful points of contact between groups is very important. Farah's spoken to that and others, and I think this is something that you're already working on fairly significantly. Just to show you a little bit of evidence to back this up, impressions of Islam among non-Muslim Canadians. This slide basically shows that those that have had frequent contact with Muslims in their community are much more positive of Islam than others. My final point is about social norms. What people think and believe is quite important, but one could argue that social norms are actually more important because that's really sort of how people behave. Changing values, changing attitudes, it's a great idea. It's important, very, very difficult to do. There's resistance to change, but it's more possible to influence normative behavior in terms of how people act in public and when they're interacting with others. I should do the slides. And I think it's good to understand and to recognize that the social norms in our society are largely holding for the most part, unlike in some other countries, Western countries, and that provides the basis for making some progress, and the action here would be to reinforce those norms against inhospitable behavior. And to finish up and give you a positive example of this, this is a slide that shows the change in Canadian public acceptance of LGBT rights over time from 1992 to 2016, showing that the increased support for same-sex marriage has doubled, and it's doubled in all age cohorts. So this is a fundamental example of social change that you rarely see. And I would argue, although I don't have time to spell out the argument, that this change is more about social norms and changing social norms than about personal opinions and values. With that, I think I will end, and thank you very much.